Good evening. Welcome to this masterclass on the world in 2021. My name is Indrajit Gupta. I'm a co-founder at Founding Fuel. It's a delight to welcome so many of you who've kind of registered and joined us this evening. First, I wanted to kind of share a word about our masterclass because this is our premium property, flagship property, on issues that are really important in today's world. This theme has obviously generated, understandably, a lot of interest because comes on the back of clearly what seems like an unprecedented year in 2020. And we've got a stellar panel of very, very fine minds who will help us make sense of what we've been through and what's to follow. Because what's to follow is equally mired in uncertainty and ambiguity. And we have, I think, a panel that can see through that fog and help us navigate what looks like certainly an interesting future ahead in the next year or so. So without much ado, I'm going to kind of quickly introduce our special guests one by one. I'd start with Frank Richter. Frank joins us from Zurich. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Indrajit. Good to see you.
Pleasure. Frank, as you know, is the chairman of Horasis. He's a familiar face in this part of the world. He's been very active in India, China, and the rest of Asia. In two roles. One, he was the director of Asia at the World Economic Forum before he started Horasis in 2005. He's a global thought leader and advises governments and works directly on a premium set of conferences in this part of the world. So welcome again, Frank. Lovely to have you.
Thank you, Indrajit.
And the next, I'd like to introduce you to Sundeep Waslekar. Hi, Sundeep.
Hi, Indrajit. Good to see you.
Pleasure to have you. Sundeep is the president of Strategic Foresight. It's a leading think tank based in Bombay, and he does work with governments around the world. He's an author. He's a very acclaimed speaker and a really fine mind that we've got to know over the years. And delighted to have you, Sundeep.
Thank you, Niranjan.
I'll come to two other guests who are joining us, good friends who are really, domain experts in their areas and are highly respected. One of them is my good friend, Niranjan Rajadhyaksha. Niranjan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi, Ajit. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah. So Niranjan moved to the IDFC Institute recently after a stint with the Mint newspaper, where he was the executive editor and looked after the edit page, and had an award-winning column, Cafe Economics, which a lot of you would have certainly read. So Niranjan and will be accompanied by G. Venkat Raman, Professor G. Venkat Raman from IIM Indore. Hi, Venkat.
Hi, Indrajit.
So Venkat joins us from Indore. He teaches at the Indian Institute of Management at Indore. And his area of work, and he's a specialist in China. And he's studied there, he's worked there, and has written for us extensively on China. And this is going to be obviously an important theme, Venkat, going forward today. So delighted to have you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So coming back to the audience that's joining us, and there are lots of people who are going to be watching this on YouTube, on the live stream on YouTube. I wanted to just tell you that this is a conversation that's going to be fast-paced. We'll keep moving these themes around and listening to the perspectives that come our way. But there are two ways in which we like you as an audience to participate. There will be a set of interactive polls that you can be part of. You can participate in those interactive polls, and there will be clear, I think, instructions that will be shared with you. You can look at the links that will be offered on the chat box. What we'd request is if you can keep another device, another phone maybe handy with internet connectivity, so that it's easier for you to participate in the polls. Because those polls will tell us where you currently stand. And it'll be interesting for you to share your perspective. We also would invite questions in the chat box. My colleague Charles and my co-founder Charles Assisi is anchoring our chat on YouTube. You would have already heard from him. And he will then pick a set of questions that he will then share with us. If you want to tweet or post on Facebook and LinkedIn as this conversation rolls on, we'd urge you to use the hashtags World in 2021 and FF Masterclass. So those are the two hashtags. I'll just repeat them again. World in 2021 and FF Masterclass. So before we join the conversation, I wanted to just kick it off with our first poll for the audience. So if you can get your phones ready, right, you'll find that there is a link that Charles would have shared on your chat box, right? It will, if you click on that link, it will take you to the first poll question, the audience poll question. And you'll see a simple set of instructions on your screen as well. So if you click on this link in your chat box, or you can, kind of go to menti.com and type in the code 729485, you will be able to access the poll question. So I'll give you a few seconds to read the instructions and to be ready to complete the poll. And Charles will be, I think, available on chat to guide you. And once you've filled up the poll, we will certainly pick up the threads on the results. But in the meantime, while we wait for you to fill up the poll, I hope you're able to see the first poll on your screen. Remember, one thing before you fill it up, is that there's no right or wrong answer. We're just keen to hear your views. So while we wait for the audience to fill out the first poll question, I wanted to come to both of you, Frank and Sundeep. 2020 turned out to be nothing like what anyone would have expected. Actually, this conversation, you might remember, we were planning to do on the world in 2020 in January this year. And it was difficult to, I think, find dates at that point in time with the both of you. But I just wonder what would have happened if we had gone ahead and done that session. So I'm just kind of curious. Both of you have been intrepid global travelers who kind of crisscross the world all year round. What has it been like for you at a personal level? Frank, do you want to kind of start first?
Sure, Indrajit. What a difficult year, what an unprecedented year. I would even say it's a watershed year in human history with all what happened. Personally, actually, I ended 2019 on a very high note. I was thinking, wow, what a difficult year, 2019. It can only become better. And then, things happened, as we all know, with COVID, first in China, then spreading all around the world. And it's not over, of course. We are now in a second wave or even in a third wave. And, if you look ahead, people might say that we are facing a new global economic crisis. Actually, not a crisis. It's basically, a standstill, maybe similar to what we have seen in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Maybe I would like to focus on one element, and we will talk about the economy a little bit later. I see a very strong, severe divide between the haves and the have-nots. It's like a digital divide, it's a social divide, it's a financial divide, it's a humanitarian divide. And I would say that COVID is making it worse. If you look into the figures, especially in the US, mostly minorities get COVID, people who are not protected, people who can't go to specialized, shopping malls and who are really exposed, people living on the streets. The same, picture in Europe, also in less developed countries. So we see this divide growing, and this actually started already last year. I was mentioning before that 2019 was a difficult year. 2019, we've seen a lot of protests in the street, starting with Paris, the Yellow Vest movement, and people saying that, we have to change government, and people wanted to get more power and wanted to have a say, and feeling that the so-called elites are governing the world and they're kind of left behind. And this is happening this year, 2020, even more. There's a lot of unrest in many parts of the world. Currently, actually, you have an unrest in Thailand. We had unrest in Chile. And I think, all these small revolutions are being interconnected. And maybe, we face like a big global revolution, something similar to the French Revolution, where, the kings were put on the chopping block. So this might sound very traumatic, but there's also hope. And why do I say this? And we talk about 2021 a bit later. We just witnessed the elections in the US, maybe the single most important event after COVID this year. And we have a new president coming in just, last night. President Trump didn't really concede, but he said basically, he's accepting somehow, there's handover of power. And what we are seeing now, actually, and again, I talk about hope and light at the end of the tunnel, we see that multilateralism might be back. Companies more and more focus on long-term visions, on sustainability, on a new Green Deal. And I wouldn't say that COVID was a blessing in disguise, don't take me wrong, but it all made us think. And maybe this crisis is an opportunity, not just to push the button and say, let's move again and as before, but really to reflect and re-engineer all the systems we are living in. And in the last 2 weeks, especially, when I talk to business people, when I talk to governments, I feel this hope now, especially now also with the vaccine potentially arriving very soon. So yes, maybe just in a nutshell, Indrajit, a very difficult year. It's devastating what's happening. It's not over, but there's hope.
But Frank, you, given the fact that you, I'm sure, spent much of 2019 crisscrossing the world, right? In your line of work where you have to meet heads of government, leaders from business, has the world changed in the way that you engage with those leaders as well?
Well, it totally changed. Today, of course, we're meeting on a Zoom call, and we are all meeting on video calls these days. We are not leaving our home office anymore. And some people can't really imagine how the world prior to COVID looked like, when we all kind of, run to the airport, take a flight, rush into cities. And it's not really necessary anymore. I think air travel will be down for years to come, and most business will be done online. Companies are refurbishing and re-strategizing their business models. Actually, just to give you an anecdote, I had a video call with head of states 2 weeks ago with the president of Nigeria and his whole cabinet office. And so it was like a half an hour Zoom call. We are thinking of creating Horasis Africa meeting. And, this was accepted. It's like a new normal that we all meet. I think digitalization is really key to pivot. And all companies can do that. We have to rethink business models. That's maybe one single positive element that, digitalization is also helping us to curb corruption. Everything, there's a lot of transparency in the system. We work on blockchains. We use even artificial intelligence. Some people say it's a fourth industrial revolution. I don't really agree with the notion of a fourth industrial revolution because the fourth industrial revolution is mostly focusing on technology and what technology can do to improve conditions of human mankind. But it's missing out the human factor. I think we have to connect also the machines to the minds. And maybe we should talk about a fifth industrial revolution, where we can really use technology for the betterment of this world.
Interesting, Frank. Thanks so much for that perspective. I know we're ready with the poll results, but I'll come to it after I've just kind of heard Sundeep. Sundeep, I just wanted your perspective on how this affected your work at a personal level to 2020. What really happened with you?
Well, Inderjit, one thing that did happen to me this year was my address change.
Okay.
Earlier, until January of this year, my address was always a particular seat number on the Swiss Air. And now suddenly my address is my home. So that's a big change for me. But one of the things that really astounded me, really shocked me, was not so much that COVID happened and that so many million people got affected and more than 1 million died and the economy collapsed. That wasn't the thing, but I was really surprised by the inefficiency and immaturity of the way in which the world leaders responded to the COVID crisis, especially in the beginning. The Director General of WHO announced global health emergency on 30th of January this year. Now, you would expect that once a global health emergency is announced, on 31st of January, the world leaders would appoint special envoys or advisors to talk to each other and to see how to coordinate a response to global crisis. None of that happened. Not only that, from 14th to 16th of February, which is just a fortnight after the global health emergency was announced, the foreign ministers and defense ministers of all major countries were together in Munich for 3 days. So Mike Pompeo was there, Wang Yi of China was there, and so many other foreign ministers and other senior ministers were there. This is 2 weeks after global health emergency has been announced and 2 weeks before the world went into lockdown. And they didn't discuss COVID as global crisis, and they didn't come out with any collaborative solutions. That shows the lack of preparedness of our world leaders to respond to crisis, even when they receive an early warning. And mind you, 30th January was not the first time COVID warning was given. There were other warnings earlier, but I won't go into those details. So that is something that has really shocked me by the inability of our world leaders to respond to crisis. And this is COVID now. What if tomorrow there are much bigger crises? If they don't have an ability to give crisis response in a very fast way, how is the world going to manage next year?
Yeah, this is very interesting. I'd like to build on it. Maybe what we could do is come back to you once we've just kind of flashed the results of the poll, because I suspect it'll throw up some things that are interesting, and then you can kind of, both of you come back to it. So I'd request Anmol to first share the results. There you have it. So we had asked people what was the most significant theme in terms of relative impact. And whopping, I think 87% of people have said that the global pandemic and the economic devastation that it brought was the most significant theme for them. And I want to turn to Sundeep on that because clearly, I mean, the COVID and what it's done weighs very heavily on our minds, no two ways about it. But the moot point really is, and I want to ask you this, are we missing the wood for the trees? Let's hear.
Well, there were 3 crises this year, and COVID was the smallest of the 3 crises. And what this poll shows is that a lot of the people around the world are not aware of the real big crisis. So the second crisis which was bigger than COVID, was that 2020 was the hottest year in the recorded history of mankind. And not only 2020 was the hottest year, but it has been the hottest period for the last 4 years. And so global warming is going up. There were a large number of forest fires this year. And this is simply not noticed. And but there is some good news coming out on response to global warming with the election of President Biden in the United States and some other development. But we'll talk about that when we talk about 2021. But the really, really big development that took place in 2020, which threatens the survival of humankind, maybe 1 million times more adversely than, or 1 billion times more adversely than the COVID or any other crisis that we have known, was that 2020 was the year when the nuclear arms race went to a much higher strategic level. This was the year when the arms race for hypersonic missiles started. Hypersonic missiles are the missiles which travel at the speed of Mach 20, Mach 25, which is Mach is the speed of sound. So 25 times the speed of sound. They cannot be detected by radars, and they carry nuclear payloads. So so far we had nuclear arms race, but there were ways to prevent a nuclear attack, and you could detect a nuclear attack. What happened in 2020 was that hypersonic missile race has started, and so now you cannot any longer detect a missile which is coming with a nuclear attack, and therefore there is a threat to the survival of humankind. The Russians started it. We started this year on the very 1st January. Russians deployed Avangard, which is the world's fastest hypersonic missiles traveling at 27 times the speed of sound. And Russia has superseded the United States like anything in the arms race. Then on 21st of March, and I'm giving you a specific date, while the world was fighting COVID, the Americans were testing their own hypersonic missile on the Hawaii Islands. And then India joined the arms race around July or August or September in the hypersonic missile category. And the Chinese were already there with their DF-17. So if human survival gets threatened, it will be because of the events of 2020. 2020 is the year when humanity's survival, the beginning of the threat to humanity's survival happened.
Right. It's a pretty dire, kind of scenario. And I'll love to turn to first Niranjan and then Venkat for a quick response to what they heard.
But I would just like to say one thing,
sure,
if you don't mind, and that is the positive.
Okay.
And while we had 3 crises, there is something that's very positive happened this year. And that is advancement of science and technology showed that science and technology is resilient to crises like whether hypersonic missile race or whether pandemic or whether even global warming. So in 2020 up to today, like 24th of November, since January, about 1,000 new discoveries, scientific discoveries and technological advancements have been made, despite everything else that happened in the world. A small country like Guatemala developed its own satellite. UAE sent a Mars mission, and Elon Musk is sending 15,000 satellites to be deployed in the space. And there were a number of developments in biotechnology, in genetic engineering, the oldest in archaeology, the oldest and the largest monument in Mayan civilization was discovered this year. All this happened this year in 2020. So science technology has proved to be resilient to these kinds of humanitarian crises. And that's the positive that we can look at next year.
If it's just a little remark, if I may, and I fully agree with you, Sundeep. Actually, years of crisis have always been years of scientific discovery. If you look back into history, when the Chinese discovered gunpowder, for example, right? It was at the time when the Chinese empire fell into 3 smaller empires, and they all fought against each other. Even during the Renaissance, with all the scientific discovery in Europe, there have been a lot of wars going on, and you can even say that in times of stability, not much discovery is happening, which is quite an interesting argument. But in principle, I fully agree with you, Sundeep.
Interesting, very interesting. So I wanted to come to Niranjan and Venkat and listen into your take on this, what you heard. Did anything catch you by surprise? Niranjan first.
Yeah, thanks. So obviously, like everyone around the table or on this call, 2020 took me by surprise, right? It's very difficult for anybody in uh, December of 2019 to have anticipated that what will happen in the next year. And I think that there are two or three big lessons here. First is, and I speak largely as an economist, so I'm going to speak on the economic side of it, that previous crises which we remember were generated from within the economic system, right? So this is what we call an exogenous shock. It just hits you. You're completely unprepared. A financial crisis, you see things bubbling in the dot-com crisis. Various crises which we remember in our memories, or even the Asian financial crisis. There are some advance warnings. This just hit you. Everybody is blindsided, and I think this is one big lesson that that all crises don't come with advanced warnings, and they often come from natural systems. So Sundeep's point about climate change is, in a way, I think if this is an exogenous shock, then climate change is the mother of all exogenous shocks, for us. So I think that's one thing. I think there are very important lessons to be learned from this year. The second, actually, I think is, while I accept Frank's point that with the coming of President Biden, multilateralism may have a second life, so to say, I think what this really underlines this year is that the nation state is back, in the game. In fact, as Sundeep was talking about the response of national leaders to an international crisis. So I think, in a way, in the age of hyper-globalization, we assume that international systems or multilateral systems would take care. But I think the nation state has been the first line of defense, I think, cooperation issue aside. So I think that's a second big thing. It has its positives and its negatives. And I think a third issue, which is really the issue of inequality, that which has been again discussed in various ways, but I think the recovery from this crisis has actually laid bare a lot of these fissures in societies, both social and economic. So I think these are the three big lessons, I think. One is that the shocks can be exogenous, not just endogenous. The second is that you can't wish away the nation state, even in a globalized world. And third is that it exposes some of our internal pressure points. So these are my opening remarks.
Interesting, Niranjan. All three are worthy of discussion in our subsequent sections, for sure. I'll quickly go to Venkat. Venkat, do you want to kind of add your own perspective to what you heard?
Yeah. So I have 2-3 things to just add to this, whatever has been spoken till now. I mean, Frank and Niranjan both spoke about growing inequalities. I mean, globalization already got with it a certain kind of inequality, which led to spurt in nationalism. The right-wing leadership in different parts of the world were able to politically mobilize constituencies, and playing on their threat perceptions. But the unfortunate news is this epidemic is going to make things worse because it has instigated a certain kind of activities whereby more and more automation is required. And this will lead to certain kind of more people being thrown out of employment. It will also lead to growth. For example, if you take in India, I mean, if you have a good digital infrastructure ecosystem, I mean, virtual online learning is a fantastic boon where, the best teaching practices can reach the nook and corners of the country. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And whatever little bit of education that was happening in the rural parts of the country, I mean, suddenly now because of this epidemic, kids are deprived of education. So this is definitely going to have a major repercussion. Second is, for me, if the moment we talk about multilateralism, three things. One is, I mean, President Biden has come, but I really wonder, despite his best efforts, whether he will be able to bring back some of the close allies of the US together, because Europe is already quite, hurt with the way it has been dealt with under Trump. So therefore, the trust deficit that has been developed, I mean, people will say that, US cannot just walk in and say that, I'll be the multilateral, leader. And whenever it wishes to do so, say, no, make America great again. That cannot happen. So tomorrow, what will happen is suddenly another Trump will come 2024. So that is a concern.
Venkat, you make good points. I think I want to dive into the moot issue about the US presidential elections, because that's the elephant in the room, because a lot of the themes around multilateralism and Trumpism, I think we can take that head on if we were to kind of unpack what the US elections really signal. So I'll thanks for your perspective, both you and Niranjan. I'll kind of move ahead and look at what, and in fact, when we were scheduling this masterclass, we had kind of assumed that the election, that there'd be delays in the election results. But again, I mean, I think none of us expected that the uncertainty would drag on as long as it did. So the big question is, what will the new US president mean for the world at large? What can we expect? And I'd like to go to Frank and pick up what both Venkat and Niranjan have also talked about, which is a multipolar world. But Niranjan spoke about the nation state and the rise of the nation state. Frank, give us your perspective of what you decode from the arrival of President-elect Biden.
Yes, interested, and lots of nuggets of wisdom in the room. Just a quick remark to you, Niranjan, and to you, Venkat, on the nation state. Indeed, the nation state is back. Think about, when COVID happened around, end of March, early April. Most European countries closed their borders. I live very close to the German border, Swiss-German border, and it was no longer possible to cross the border, something totally unheard of. And despite, all the multilateralism we experienced in the last 20, 30, 40 years, right, we fall back almost into the Middle Age. Just a quick remark to you, Venkat, on the future of work. I agree with you. With technology, a lot of people will lose their jobs, mostly in advanced economies of North America and Europe. Think about, the American truck drivers connecting between the East and the West Coast with self-driving vehicles, right? We don't need all this, maybe millions of people doing this work. And with artificial intelligence, you can replace even the work of an intellectual, of, let's say, a lawyer, of maybe even an economist. So we are living in a brave new world. When it comes to politics, there's, of course, hope that Biden is getting back into this whole multilateral realm. He announced that in his first day in office, he will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. He will also rejoin WHO and others. But, in principle, I think he will keep many of the lines and the thoughts President Trump actually was building and was creating, especially vis-a-vis China. I think there won't be any sea change in how America is dealing with China. Maybe the whole rhetoric is changing and, the tone and the way he will talk to the Chinese. But in principle, I think he will follow the same policies. Even Europe, I'm European, and I'm a fan of the transatlantic partnership. And a lot of Europeans are a little bit blue-eyed, saying that, we go back, to the good old times where we can always rely on a strong America, even providing defense to most European countries. I think they are wrong. Biden will keep actually this kind of approach where America is no longer the kind of firefighter in the world and helping other nations. And he will ask Europe to build much more of the defense capabilities. But in general, the dimension is clear. Biden is a multilateral thinker. He will work on partnerships around the world. We have seen even the signs of the G20 earlier this week, that the G20 might be more important in the future, not longer the club of the G7, G8, the old world, but involving now India and other nations. And I think Biden understood it, and he will put America into the right position. About China, I think we will talk in a minute, and I think here both Niranjan and Venkat and Sundeep also will join. But for me, the most important alliance partnership difference in the world to watch really is the US-China relationship. Are we moving from a kind of Cold War environment into a hot war? And you know, the war so far, let's say the Cold War, is mostly linked to the trade relationship, you know, the trade imbalances between both countries. Now there's also a fight for technical supremacy. It's like a tech war. And there might be even a hot war. And what Sundeep mentioned before, you know, the missiles and all that, it is not only Russia, America, it's more and more China.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think Cold War or hot war, Sundeep, what's your take? Before you come in, I just wanted to put up a question that is coming from our audience. This is from Dwarikinath Dungal. I think he's talking about the fact that there's a new US administration and there will be a demand on them to try and engage with the world community to overcome the current crisis and assist in economic recovery, especially in the developing world. What will Biden do? What's your take?
Thank you, Indrajit, and thank you, Dwarikanath Dungal, very distinguished former civil servant of Nepal. He's probably writing from Kathmandu, I presume. Well, I agree fully with Frank and others, Venkat and Niranjan, that US-China relationship is going to be the major fault line, not only in 2021, but probably in the next decade. But let us not forget also that there is a fault line between the United States and Russia, and it's not going to be erased. In terms of attention, the China-US fault line will get a lot more attention and a lot more energy and a lot more political capital. But US-Russia fault line is also very significant. And mind you, while Obama during his presidency was relatively pacifist, he was very aggressive in relationship with Russia. And it is under his presidency that the war in Ukraine started. And the war in Syria, the US intervention was there, where again it was a proxy war with Russia. So there may be a continuation of Cold War with China, but there could be a hot war with Russia. I think when we talk about the multilateralism, it's not a vague concept. There are concrete institutional steps that Biden will have to take or reject. So, of course, he has announced that he will join the Paris Accord on the 21st of January. And I agree with Frank that he will join the WHO and the UNESCO at some stage. But around the 1st, 2nd of February, he will have to take a decision on a very concrete multilateral issue. And that is the New START Treaty. The New START Treaty puts a cap on the number of nuclear warheads that you can deploy. And that is currently 2,500 warheads between US and Russia. Now, once the New START Treaty is expired, there will be no more restrictions on anybody deploying nuclear warheads, whether it is Russia, US, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, anybody. And then you will have a open season, free for all. So Biden will have to take a concrete decision around the 1st, 2nd of February on whether to continue the existence of the New START Treaty, at least for the next few years, by the time they work out some kind of a long-term solution to the problem. And this is going to be influenced by relationship with Russia a lot more than relationship with China, because China doesn't have any deployed warheads, at least as of now. So this US-Russia fault line is going to be important. It's going to provide the critical test of Biden's commitment to multilateralism, and very immediately, right in the 1st week of February. So that is one. On the question of America's attitude towards developing countries and providing an economic Marshall Plan, as Dwarikanath Dungal was asking us, it might happen in the context of new economy, not so much assistance, but mobilization of economic resources. One of the big announcements that the Biden team has already made is that they will create a new Green Deal. And the new Green Deal is very substantial. Biden will mobilize, he has committed $2 trillion of US public money. Plus, he will mobilize $3 trillion of US private money if he succeeds. So that's $5 trillion. US GDP is $20 trillion. So you are talking about 25% of US GDP being mobilized just for shifting from old economy to an ecologically sensitive new economy of renewable energy and a mechanism that will respond to climate crisis. Now, not only Biden, the President Xi Jinping, in his address to the United Nations General Assembly in September, announced that China will become carbon neutral by 2060. And Biden, by the way, has announced that America will become carbon neutral by 2050. And the EU has already announced that Europe will become carbon neutral by 2050. So one of the biggest things that will happen in 2021 that we should watch out for is the move by the three big economic powers, United States, China, and EU, towards shifting the economic gears from the old economy to new economy with trillions, not billions anymore, but trillions of dollars of investments. And when you look at US-China relations, this is going to be very important because this entire shift to new economy to a large extent depends on China because they are the biggest suppliers of rare earth elements, which are required for the solar panels and wind turbines. So we are looking at very complex interrelationships between the emerging economic dynamic and the political environment, and Biden will have to take specific actions, as will Xi Jinping, as will Putin.
Very interesting, Sundeep. I wanted to kind of dive a little deeper on the China question because that obviously has implications for India as well, clearly. And I wanted to kind of bring Venkat in because I think there's a question for him from our good friend Srini in Bloomberg in UK. And this is a question that Venkat and I had discussed a couple of days ago, which is about this whole plan to isolate China in the global arena. And I wanted to kind of contrast this with what you were saying, Sundeep, is that when Srini asks, and I'm reading this, is what Trump did in his first 4 years, especially with regard to China, just his idiosyncratic policy, or is it symptomatic of a deeper effort to isolate China in the global arena? Now, the question that I'd asked, I think we discussed with Venkat and I, was, is isolating China a realistic strategy in the first place? Venkat, do you want to kind of come in and just build on the question that Srini has raised?
Yeah. So I think the question faced by scholars, and they have examined the question, is whether it's purely a technological war or it's an ideological war. So when we are talking of Cold War II, World War I was an ideological war. Cold War II, is it an ideological war? And I don't see this whole question of ideological war and technological war being different. Because what is at the heart of this whole story is that the Americans believe that the Chinese model of state capitalism enables the Chinese authoritarian system to galvanize all the energies that the government has and its tech startups in the form of Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, and various others have, to mobilize them, and the government is in a position to make them do what it wants them to do, and it has massive funds. Now, if you contrast that with something like what happens in US, I mean, if the American White House says the Google to do something which will drive its foreign policy agenda, Google, it may say yes, but it also has the freedom to say no. So that makes things very jittery, number one. Number two, the point is, can you isolate China? I mean, whether we like it or not, they have dug their heels too deep into the global supply chains. And it's not going to be very easy to pick and choose, what are the domains where you'll be isolating China? What are the domains where you will not be isolating China? See, for example, I cannot say China is, one of the markets which is doing extremely well. So, for example, Americans cannot say that I'm not going to give chips to China, but I'm fine I'm fine with a China where I can export my luxury goods, because it's already, people are saying that it is going to be the #1 luxury market in the world. So similarly, if I can bring India, for example, in this whole story, India cannot say, India cannot say that, I would ban 58 apps because of whatever security concerns I have, or even for that matter, Americans. But India at the same time cannot, say that I'm not going to do business here, but I'm okay with the idea of getting APIs from China for my pharmaceutical companies. So this picking and choosing is going to be extremely difficult for countries, whether it is United States or whether it is India. So I think it's going to be extremely difficult to isolate as such. However, what is going to happen is, companies are going to, countries and, corporations are going to hedge, and manage their risk by trying to say, for example, earlier, if they were putting 10 eggs out of 12 eggs in the China basket, now they are perhaps going to make 6 or 7, but they will continue to be 6 and 7. It's not that, suddenly 10 eggs will go somewhere outside and only 2 will be left in China. Because please let us not forget that American companies and Japanese companies, for example, they are going to resist tremendously and wrestle with their respective governments. But we are business organizations, and this is where we are thriving in these very difficult times. You cannot expect us to make our business less competitive just for your political and strategic goals. So these are very, very difficult, questions that countries have to face.
But I just wanted to thank you for that. I wanted to pick up the threads on this with Frank and Sundeep. I think Sundeep was making the larger point to me earlier that there are structural reasons why Biden will be hamstrung in changing what Trump did with China. Sundeep, do you want to come in, and then we'll go to Frank with your quick views before we start a poll question on this?
Well, sure, Indrajit. But before we come to the structural reasons, one very quick comment on what Venkat was saying about how the Western corporates are going to react to the expectations from the US government to isolate China, if at all. One evidence that we have on the ground is in Hong Kong. After the Chinese government introduced this new security law, most of the Western companies based in Hong Kong just fell in line. They are not complaining against the security law, at least publicly, and they're just singing the tune. And that is one concrete evidence as to how I've been talking to many friends in Hong Kong, and that's what it's showing. They may privately complain, but officially their policy is to have their access to the mainland market open, and they are just following the Chinese government's guidelines. But that's a specific on the behavior of the corporates. But the broader issue is that the US-China relationship is not going to be that even. It's not going to be just the relationship of enmity, and it's not going to be the newly found friendship. That is something that we have to accept. That the truth is going to be in the gray area. It's not going to be either black or white that Trump would like. And I think Biden will recognize the importance of the gray area. There is no doubt a fact that China is a rising economic, political, and technological power. That's very important. And there is no doubt that the United States is still a well-established economic, political, and technological power. And historically, there is always a conflict between emerging power and the established power. It is called the Thucydides trap, which was pronounced by the Greek philosopher Thucydides, I think 500 BC or something. That there is always an ongoing conflict between an emerging power and an established power. And so those tensions will be there between United States and China. And by the same logic, in the Asian theater, there will be conflicts between China and India with whatever Hindi chini bye bye that some people might want to sing, because China is now a more established power in Asia, and India is trying to be an emerging power in Asia. And so there will be a tension between China and India for the structural reasons. The second aspect is what I earlier referred to in the context of the response to climate change. That when you make a shift towards the new economy, of renewable energy and wind turbines and artificial intelligence, not only climate change, but in many other contexts, and sensors. The elements that you require for that are rare earth elements. And China is the single most significant exporter of rare earth elements, rare earth metals, accounting for 97%. So if the Western economies, US and EU both, want to shift to green economy, and they are able to mobilize these trillions of dollars, finally the input is very much going to come from China. And if China decides not to export rare earth elements, they are going to be in trouble. China already made an experiment with it. For a short while, they refused to export this to Japan, and the Japanese got very jittery about it. And the Chinese have a big handle. The third important factor is that Chinese technological capacity has increased very substantially. A lot of people in India, in our country, think that China's main strength is by cheap labor and by its primacy in the manufacturing sector. That was maybe 10, 15 years ago. Now, there are what is called petaflop computers, which are the fastest computers in the world. And the fastest computer in the world is a Japanese computer, and that is 400 petaflop. But amongst the 100 petaflop computers that exist in the world, majority belong to China, about 50, 60 belong to China. And except for 3-4 of the Japanese computers, there's a race between China and the United States. It's a big race in the high technology, not the digital technology, but this high technology of petaflop computers and the space science. China has been able to land a probe on the other side of the moon. And China is now preparing for a probe to go to the moon and collect samples and come back. And China has already developed an ASAT weapon. So and if Elon Musk is putting out 15,000 satellites in the outer space and introduce a new internet, the Chinese with their space power can demolish that in the case of a war in a fraction of a minute. So there is a strength on both sides.
Sure.
It's not that we have to overestimate Chinese strength. There is a strong established strength with the Americans. There's a strong emerging strength with the Chinese. And this tussle is going to be there. Sure. It's natural, and it's only a question of how the two sides manage that tussle.
Got it. I'd like to bring Frank in here at this stage. Frank, you're familiar with, very familiar with China. And you obviously have a take on how this game is progressing. Complex, multidimensional, but love to hear your perspective.
Well, interested. I lived in China, as you know, for 4 years. And even as a young student, I was traveling around China. I think I've been in all Chinese provinces, with the exception of Ningxiang. I've been to, the Himalaya mountains. I've been to all the rivers. I've been to Mongolia, Inner Mongolia. And, when I went there first time, I think at the tender age of 21, I've seen people living in caves. Not just like in the Middle Age, but like almost in the Stone Age. And this was only, 30 years ago. Now, of course, it's a totally different China we are seeing. And Sundeep mentioned this, and Venkat as well before. China is so strong economically. China is no longer a Me Too economy, just copying things. They're really at the forefront of development. And maybe, you mentioned Elon Musk before, he started with Tesla and the whole hype, but the real winners in electric cars will be the Chinese. And, they have amazing models coming out right now. And of course, they have the big market. Talking about decoupling, and that's maybe the word economists are using. America wants to decouple China and said, we want to isolate China. And you've seen, Trump's rhetoric saying that, Chinese tech companies can't use, American-made chips anymore, or like Google kind of operating systems, and putting, companies like Huawei in a very difficult situation. But maybe I should say, and I'm using a Russian word for that, it's a bit like a Sputnik moment for China, because Huawei and other tech companies have to develop their own technology. And Huawei is doing exactly this right now, and competing with iOS, the operating system on most mobile phones, and others are putting forward their standards. I think, and this might be a very kind of dangerous, but maybe eye-opening argument. Everybody is saying, US is trying to isolate China. I would say the opposite. China is isolating America. And friends, it's happening right now. Think about the new trade deal between Asian nations, RCEP, which was just announced a few days ago, with China as the epicenter. It's basically ASEAN countries plus China, plus Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, all Western countries. And nobody is asking for America. Even so, Biden wants to do, new multilateral trade deals. He might actually drive the TPP deal, the original deal, but he's not welcome to be part of RCEP. It's China dominated, and the Japanese are cherishing it. The Koreans the same, and especially the Australians. And that's what I mean. That China is isolating America. America is really, moving back or being pushed back in so many areas. Beside RCEP, there's of course One Belt, One Road, the link, from China to Central Asia to Europe, and many European countries actually very much rely on Chinese investments, and not only Eastern European countries like Serbia, Hungary, Poland, but even Italy. Italy is basically selling some of its best companies to Chinese large SOEs and private companies. And, small Switzerland actually was one of the first European countries taking part and signing up on One Belt, One Road to the actually unhappiness of the European Union, but it happened. So yes, China is on the rise. China is pushing forward in a very strategic manner, and of course bolstered by what Sundeep and Venkat mentioned before, the whole technical angle, powerful companies. Maybe one small and minor revision here. Yes, China is still a state-driven economy, but what's really counting in China now are the private companies. The dream of most young Chinese people is to found their own companies, to be entrepreneurs. And that's one notion. It's called xiahai in Mandarin. It's kind of jumping into the sea, even without education, just go for it and create your own company. And that's, it's almost like a new land of opportunity or a startup nation. And those private companies are more and more taking over. They're not state-driven. They're not directed by Beijing. They do whatever they want. One misunderstanding is always that China is kind of conquering Africa with their state-owned companies. But it's a private sector, a private sector that just go there and discover opportunities. And yes, sometimes there are no strings attached. There maybe do not reflect necessarily the Western kind of, governance systems that just do business. And in some instances, there have been clashes. But China is the new power, and Sundeep, yes, the rise and fall of the new powers. The famous book also by Paul Kennedy, I think written some 45 years ago, the American economist who taught at Harvard. He was basically saying that, the time of an interregnum is so dangerous. One country is falling, one is rising, and there will be clashes. And I have no doubt there will be further clashes between China and America, even now with President Biden at the helm.
Sure. Thank you. That was incredibly interesting perspective. I just wanted to pick up one of the themes of what Frank touched upon, which is the free trade agreement, RCEP, because that's, as Frank was talking about, is seen as a shot in the arm for China in combating the influence of the US and its Western allies. And Niranjan, I just wanted to come to you on this one, because that's with Japan part of it. I mean, it makes it the biggest trading bloc by far. And India has chosen to kind of sit on the sidelines. So from your perspective, in terms of how this landscape is kind of changing, what are your biggest concerns, if at all? Are you concerned?
Yeah, so Ajit, thanks. I just go back to China, just 2 comments on China. Quick, I won't take up too much time. See, first, obviously, you can't but notice and perhaps even admire the rise of China, right? But I think there are 2 points. I think one is a lot of the narrative and analysis is about what the US or what the Europeans are doing to contain China. I don't think enough attention is paying what the Chinese themselves are doing in response. It's a strategic interaction, right? China is not sitting back. And I think it's this dual circulation strategy which they've announced. Even they want to be dependent on their own home market. So I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic. China itself wants to exit a lot of industries. It's not just the US wanting its companies out. The second quick point I want to make is that the Chinese economic model has largely been driven by rising labor force and rising investment. And now they're trying to switch to an innovation-led economy, technology-led. And this is what most countries have done in their development trajectory. However, this switch has never been smooth throughout economic history. No country has effortlessly switched from being driven by capital accumulation to being driven by ideas and innovation. So let's also realize that China itself may have a lot of turbulence in the next 10 years as it tries to switch its economic model. So that's just a quick comment. See, about RCEP, I don't want to get into the details of RCEP. It's very clear that the backdrop is one, growing concern about China in the Indian policy circles, and of course the military standoff has worsened it. The second is that there is growing protectionist sentiment even within the Indian political system. And I'm saying political system because I have a sense that it's not just the ruling dispensation, but even other parties who believe that, why are we trading so much? Why do we have a trade deficit, etc.? So I think the worry is really this, that we can take the wrong lessons from all this and say that, India can be sort of unilaterally isolationist in this complex world, and I worry about it, because if you want supply chains to move to India, even in some proportion, you have to also be open to imports, because supply chains are based on the trade and intermediate goods, so unless you can import, you can't export. So that's, I think, one concern, that the wrong lessons may be taken out of this thing, that, we should go on our own way. Second, I think if India is going to stay out of RCEP, I think there's still an option to re-enter, but if India is going to stay out of RCEP because of the fear of China, then there have to be alternate FTAs signed, right? So there's an FTA with the EU, which is hanging fire for a very long time. If there's a new TPP, and if President Biden offers India, although it's trans-Pacific, but if in some way India can enter it. So I think India needs then a plan B, that if you're not going to be in the largest trade bloc existing in the world, then where are you going to be? So so there are opportunities from this entire realignment of supply chains, but India has to remain an open trading nation. And if it doesn't want to be in the RCEP, then it has to figure out new trade negotiations, new trade blocs it needs to be part of.
Sure. No, this is very interesting because it kind of takes us straight into another poll question that we had planned, which was obviously around the earlier question around the Biden presidency and what it means for India, because I think there is a lot of optimism that America might come to our, in some ways, a rescue if there is trouble on our borders, but God only knows what's likely to happen. So I'd request us to run the next audience poll. I think we're sharing a screen again to give you a sense of the instructions, so that you have that with you. Could we have the instructions? Yeah, there it is. So this is the way that you can be part of the second poll. There is a separate code for it. Just make sure that you key in this code, and while you kind of take a minute or two, we will continue with our conversation. Just give me a sec. Yeah. So I heard you, Niranjan, talk about the whole set of options that present ourselves. So I just kind of come back and look at the results in a bit. But while we do that, Venkat, do you have any things to add to this conversation on the Free Trade Agreement, RCEP? Because I know you've been studying it closely.
So Niranjan has actually brought up some very nice points, and maybe just give it a thought, just touch on one or two of them.
Yes.
One is he spoke about this protectionist mindset, and this is something which has been a part of our system. It's not that the current dispensation has brought it in. This is a part of our mindset. Second is India. After opting, it seems to be signaling that we perhaps have got into, we are going to look towards US and Europe because of the China factor. Now, the thing is, to what extent, India will be able to continue with its policy of neutrality and what people call it, quote unquote, strategic autonomy. To what extent we can maintain a strategic autonomy, that is one thing. A second is, one of the things that is being said about RCP, the Western critics have said that RCP is something which is a shallow integration. It is not something which is a free trade agreement like the one which TPP had, and in terms of different things. So people have criticized this, saying that it's a shallow integration. But people forget that this kind of a shallow integration perhaps is also more purposive on the part of ASEAN countries who actually believe in state, not giving complete control to market mechanism when it comes to doing business. So the state would like, and many of these countries have had a certain kind of, colonial hangover, if one can say so. And India's experiences also seem to be somewhat similar, that where the state does not want to yield complete control, we do have a colonial hangover experience. Our experiences with China have not been good, but so does history say that our experiences with the West has not been very great either, including the US.
Sure.
So therefore, given all this, I suppose for India's priorities, still I think it makes sense in terms of certain kind of, it suits India more at a certain psychological level, Indian psyche, to be a part of a RCEP rather than be a part of TPP, where it might be finding it very difficult to resist arm twisting as and when it takes place down the line.
Super. So we're kind of ready to look at the poll results. The question that we'd asked, which is that what will the Biden presidency signal for India? And we had given 4 options. You had to pick one. And a very large percentage of people, the largest percentage, seem to believe that they will put diplomatic pressure on Kashmir and other human rights issues, which is quite interesting. And 25% each believe that there is, 24% say that there is a possibility of a stronger united front against China and the easing of immigration restrictions. I'll come to Sundeep and then to Frank. Sundeep, what would you read into these results, and what is your view on this?
Well, I'll comment on the poll, but yes, I'm very tempted to tell you just one short story about China that Frank and I experienced, and then I'll come to the poll.
Sure.
That 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, Frank and I were together in Beijing, and we met the China Entrepreneurs Club, which is the biggest private sector conglomeration of the Chinese entrepreneurs. And we are both into scenario planning, and they asked us, can you prepare scenarios for us? And I said, yes, we can prepare scenarios for China 2030, China up to 2030. This was 2010. So the China 2010 from 2030. And they said, oh, well, we already know what's going to happen until 2030. Can you prepare scenarios beyond 2030? And this was way back in 2010. Anyway, that's about the confidence of the Chinese. But coming to the poll, the reality is that in a dynamic where the relationships are international relationships are primarily between the states, the interests of the state are quite different from the interest and the views of the people who are in the leadership of the state many a time. So Biden as a politician, as a leader of the Democratic Party, or Kamala Harris as politicians might have had certain views on human rights, on many other aspects. But when they are dealing with India in their official capacity on behalf of the state structure of the United States, they are going to look at the interest of the United States state. They are not going to look at their private views. They would have some small impact. So I don't really think that their own views on any of these political issues which are of regional significance or internal significance to India really matter all that much. I think at the end of the day, they will make a very cold-blooded, hard-nosed calculation of how to deal with India and how to maximize the interest for the United States as a nation and as a state. And they will deal with India on those terms. And if they want to create difficulties to India for the reasons that have to do with their statist agenda, they might use human rights or anything else that they want. But human rights could never be the reason. So I think many of the people are very wrongly perceiving the private opinions of the emerging duo in the White House as their possible public stance. I think this is totally wrong. What is not clear, and Frank was talking about it earlier, from Biden's statement so far after his election in the last few days, is what is exactly going to be his worldview. This is not clear yet completely. We know he's been talking in favor of multilateralism. That part is a lot more clear. But what is his going to be overall worldview? How is he going to look at the power structure of the world? And within that, how is he going to look at big players like China and even to some extent Russia? And is he going to look at this world with a Cold War mentality, as a lot of people fear, and as we also mentioned it today, or is he going to have a totally new view? And it's only when Biden spells out his worldview, he will then see where India fits into the worldview. Biden is not going to make India his view and then construct his vision of the world around it. And he's not going to use his personal views on human rights or whatever to construct his vision of India and then the vision of the world. First, he's going to decide what is in America's interest, what kind of world they want, because Donald Trump essentially looked at a world as a place at risk. He didn't look at the world as a place of opportunities. So therefore, he wanted to stop the immigrants from coming in. He wanted to sell arms. He wanted to walk away from various United Nations forums because he thought everybody was at risk, that America's interests were at risk, that America was a loser. That's what really the underlying psychology of Donald Trump was. Now, is Biden going to look at the world as a place of opportunities, or is he going to look at the world as a place at risk? And so once Biden defines his worldview, then he will see where India fits into it. And only then we will know how they are going to manage, construct their relationship with India. I think it will be too premature for us to draw any conclusions before that.
Fair point. I'll Frank and Niranjan, I'm just going to come to you on a different theme now, because I wanted to shift the conversation to the global economy, because I think that continues to remain in the doldrums. Global public debt is at an all-time high. Job growth has been threatened by the lockdown. And of course, the impact of technology is not making it any easier. So I wanted to come to Niranjan first, and then I'll come to you, Frank. Niranjan, as an economist, what are your kind of big questions on your mind about the state of the global economy when you take maybe a 12, 13 month kind of view? Are we headed into a global recession, you believe?
Yeah, so we are already in a global recession, but yeah, I think 2-3 quick points. First is, I think for the next 2 years, we need to shift our gaze from economic growth rates to the size of the economy, because so much output has been lost that, because of these large declines in output in this year, next year will look like a fantastic year. But actually, it's just the global economy clawing its way back to the pre-COVID times. So I think just one warning that whenever next year is going to be a lot of good news if you look at growth rates, but I would look at the GDP of various countries and the world itself. The second big question, which I think which goes back to the inequality issue, is this recovery going to be led by profits or is it going to be led by wages? This is a classic problem in macroeconomics. So I'll just give you the Indian example. If you've seen the results for the second quarter of this year, companies have done well, but they've done well largely because they have slashed labor costs, large layoffs, wage cuts, etc. Which, if you have this situation where there's weak employment growth and stagnant wage growth, then the consumption recovery at some point will falter. So therefore, unless the growth is broad, the recovery is broad-based, it can't be just concentrated profits in a few, large enterprises, which is what is happening in India, and I assume is going to happen in a lot of the world. So that's the second point I wish to make. The third worry is actually, you're absolutely right. The debt to GDP ratios have increased because of all this fiscal stimulus. The governments have had to, basically do the heavy lifting in a weak economy. Now, how do you exit this, right? So, if you look at global history, there are three ways countries exit from large public debt burdens. One is they tax very heavily. So basically, you claw back all your tax breaks and everything. Basically, tax rates rise substantially. The second is countries inflate away their debt. So they basically, through monetary expansion or whatever, let inflation, eat into the real value of the debt. Or third, there is what is called financial repression, where interest rates are kept below inflation, and therefore the largest debtor is in a way is going to be the beneficiary. So if you look at the previous big episode when public debt could have overwhelmed economies, which is after the end of World War II, where most countries came out with public debts of 150%, 200%, even more. You had some combination of this. You had, inflation, high tax rates, and financial repression. So I think it's not so much the public debt per se which worries me right now, but what the implications of that are. And I don't think enough attention has been paid. So yeah, these are the three broad things. I said, look past the noisy news about growth rates next year. Is the recovery profits led or wage led? And third is this: how do you exit the public debt trap?
Very interesting and very well put. Thanks so much for that. Frank, any quick comments on what you heard? And I know you have a particular worry on this whole debt to GDP ratio going out of whack, and that we are kind of giving up our future for.
Right. Yeah, I would say we are facing like a lost decade, or even like two lost decades, right? For 20 years, quite depressive. A lost generation of youngsters who can't find jobs. Like the so-called Corona generation. India, and I'm sorry to say this, is potentially underperforming from an economic point of view, and especially when it comes to the protectionist sentiment Niranjan mentioned before. And this protectionist sentiment has been around for many, many years, right? Not just with this government, but the governments before. And it's even, some of the major industrialists got this protectionist mindset and say, whenever there's competition from the outside, like now with the Chinese, let's close borders. And I feel it's dangerous. If you want to compete with China, you have to basically work with them, compete with them neck by neck. You shouldn't isolate yourself. And I think on the long run, it's really a strategic mistake potentially to not be part of the RCEP club, because all these supply chains will be rearranged in Asia. Taking 30% of global GDP. Take a Japanese car maker, he will manufacture parts in China, Thailand, Indonesia, still in Japan. And India is just a market to export, right, or to produce locally, and it's not part of global supply chain. So that's very, very dangerous for India. And India has to open up and not just, say, it's a manufacturing paradise in the future, like the made in China, a made in India paradigm, but it should be like a trade with India paradigm. India should be open, part of ASEP, the European Indian trade deal, should be looked again into more depth with more flexibility on both sides. Same with America. When it comes to the global economy, I feel that on the long term, India could be a new engine of global growth, could be, but many things need to change, and especially on the trade angle. If we say that, on the long run, where is the economy heading? Yes, next year, Niranjan, your point, there will be recovery, good news, vaccine, GDP growth. But on the long run, what this mean? Like investments into the new Green Deal and alternative energy takes a lot of time, lots of resources, and maybe a lot of economists now talk about degrowth as the new strategy, and saying we shouldn't really go for GDP anymore, but we should just go in very small steps. We should give up the mentality of growing more and more. And if you say, the usual fuel of the economy actually are the banks, lending money. Now we have no interest rates and negative interest rates. So what does it mean? Are we moving into like a new kind of deflationary spiral, a bit like what Japan experienced after the Japanese bubble? So yes, very, very uncertain times. And on top, the two risks Sundeep mentioned before, the geopolitical dimension and of course climate change. So there are many reasons to say that that the current state of the world is quite gloomy. And the question is, what kind of solutions are there? Let's talk about solutions. Where do the solutions come from? Are they coming from the nation states? Is Joe Biden, Angela Merkel, or Narendra Modi able, to find solutions for their own countries, or is it only possible in the concert of nations, joining hands with the G20 at the core, which means that we have to open up everything, right? We have to collaborate. And we have to kind of, tear down the kind of Chinese walls put between us. I say Chinese walls, of course, ironically here, right? Saying that, there are so many walls around us, that the Trump wall to Mexico. And if we do that, we face issues we faced in the 1920s, 1930s, right? When protectionism came up and a lot of, borders were closed, that at the time, that all the problems we had were even, aggravated and become worse and worse. So that's just a quick analysis. And I say that, yes, we are very much in uncharted waters.
Okay. On that note, Frank, I'm going to kind of move to the last poll that we've planned for the audience, which is, again, there is a different code, but this is really around India and what could be possible risks and shocks for the India story over the next, in 2021. And we'll come back and look at the results after the audience has had a chance to complete it. In the meantime, I'll get Niranjan and perhaps Venkat also to interpret the results when it comes and share their perspective. But I wanted to kind of utilize this time to just shift the conversation. We'll come back to the polls on India and the India story on the risks. But I wanted to bring Sundeep in on something that he's all too familiar, which is geopolitics and the Middle East. Because Trump's exit has certainly thrown up very interesting questions about the US's relationship with the Saudis and, of course, Iran as well. And it has implications for India as well. So, Sundeep, what do you think we can expect to happen in the Middle East over the next year? And I'm conscious of the time, so I'll request you to.
Right. This is going to be an interesting question, but I would say briefly that the Middle East got realigned in the last couple of years. Traditionally, it was the Israel versus the Palestinians. Now you have two groups. On the one side, you have Israel plus the Arabs, which is Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain. And on the other side, you have Turkey and Iran. And forget Pakistan, who are kind of piggybacking on Turkey-Iran axis. But basically, these are the two groups. And India is close to the Israel plus Arab axis. Now, this Israel-Arab axis was very much enabled by Trump. The question is whether the new US administration will pamper this axis. I mean, they will always have good relationship with Israel, but will they pamper Saudi Arabia? I'm not sure. I don't know. Will they pamper any practices that Saudi Arabia might indulge in if they do, like the Khashoggi murder case? So there may be some changes in the relationship between US and Saudi Arabia, which could have an impact on this whole alignment. And if this axis gets a little bit weakened, or if the relationship with the US gets weakened, there will be implications for India. But so there's a new alignment which has come up, and we have to see where it goes.
Right. Thank you for that. I'll see if we can flash the polls. Anmol, do we have the polls available? Wow. Okay, that's interesting. So the question was, from our lens, that's the India lens, what poses the biggest threat to the India story in 2021? And I think the largest block is about economic, which is the deteriorating investment and consumption demand in our economy, and I think stalling of the key reform process in labor, land, agriculture, and banking. I like maybe Niranjan quickly, and then followed by Venkat, to provide your take on this. Niranjan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I sort of agree with the 46% who worry about investment and consumption in India. But just a quick word about the reforms. Actually, I think there have been a fair, the past few months, there does seem to be some momentum to economic reforms. Now, is that is that the best set of reforms you can have? You can debate about it. So, for example, I've been a critic of the way the GST was rolled out. So even these reforms, the details matter. But actually, I agree that the real big worries right now are it's almost 5-7 years of an investment drought, and consumer spending also is weakening. So it's a long story. I won't tell you why, but even well before COVID, you saw consumers deleverage in India, and consumer spending substantially decelerate. So in fact, with poor domestic investment growth and poor domestic consumption growth, it's all the more important that we seek export markets. So at this point of time, to go into a protectionist shell actually worsens our economic options. So it just plays back into the big fear about India going into protectionist shell, because the drivers of domestic demand have been pretty weak in the past few years.
Got it.
So I agree with the overall assessment of the poll.
Sure. Venkat, you in a minute, you want to kind of give us your take before we...
So escalation of hostilities with China, that's what I'm going to touch on. So 11%, I'm not very sure how to interpret it. Perhaps, our audience feels that China is a given anyway, we have to deal with it. So it's not, that kind of an interpretation, I would say. But I think, honestly speaking, this kind of a response also comes from, with due respect to our audience, there seems to be underestimation of this whole China factor on one hand. So I think India has to worry about China. India has to deal with China. I keep on saying that one of the things which is going to be key to our success is how do we frame our policy to China? How do we deal with China? So therefore, we need to be strong. We cannot be bullied by them, but at the same time, we need to understand that we also need to work with China. We cannot continue to have this adversarial mindset.
Got it.
And we need to understand, we need to understand their strengths as well. Last point is just to elaborate on this. We need to go beyond, looking at this world only with Sinocentric lens. To give an example, in one of the things about RCEP, which is being said, is that China, Japan, and Korea, these three countries have been working since 2007 to have a free trade agreement among themselves. Now RCEP, now it has materialized, it will give them a platform to work towards that. Now what happens if that gets, that is achieved? Then India cannot, afford to isolate itself with this big thing called China. India needs to engage with the world.
Yeah. No, very, very well put. I'm going to kind of request now Frank first and then Sundeep in a minute to try and kind of wrap up your closing kind of comments. In a minute, if you can provide something that leaves people with food for thought going forward into 2021.
Right. So many issues, of course, we cover today, and so many challenges and problems on the economic side, on the health side. I mentioned my initial comment, the dimension of hope. I think the hope is still there if we all collaborate and join hands. And a lot of signs, even in Europe, there have been nationalist governments, for example, in Hungary, in Poland, in Austria, and we see this nationalist movement is actually weakening. And even in the UK, this whole Brexit movement. And that's maybe the hope with, the kind of leaving of Trump of the White House, that there's a movement in the world where this kind of populist parties, are kind of moving to the wall, and the new kind of free-thinking liberal voices are taking over. And that's my hope that, these liberal voices join hands and make this world a better place to live on.
That's a great note to end. Thanks, Frank. Sundeep, quick thoughts, comments from you?
Well, just a one thought for you, Indrajit, and your founding fuel team and the audience.
Yeah.
If we had this session a year ago, as we were planning, and if you had asked us to project what would happen in 2020, to be perfectly honest with you, I wouldn't have talked about the risk from COVID or any such pandemic, even though there was a writing on the wall already by Gates and by the Global Pandemic Monitoring Board and others. But still, I wouldn't have caught that signal and I wouldn't have projected. So the thought I want to leave with you and others is a question. What is that can happen in 2021, either positive or destructive, that we can't imagine today at all, the way we couldn't imagine COVID last year? And what is that thing that will happen, the swan, the black swan, the wild card, whatever you call it? What is that going to happen in 2021 that's going to shake us? And shake us maybe in a destructive way, some nuclear war or something, or shake us in a very positive way, like the wave of hope that Frank alluded. And let's hope that whatever that happens is positive and gives us a lot more hope next year. But let's think, what is that going to be in 2021 that we cannot imagine today? If you can find that answer tonight, let me know tomorrow.
That's a lovely note to end on. And I wish we could have gone on. I had had a couple of other segments planned, but I'm absolutely conscious of the time. What I'd like to do at this stage is to suggest that we continue this conversation on our Slack channel, so that this is such a vast theme to really, be able to cover in 90 minutes. But thanks to the four of you, we've had a fantastic discussion, I think. So thank you all four of you, Frank, Sundeep, Niranjan, and Venkat. We'd love to have more questions come in on the Slack group, and all the questions that we couldn't answer on the YouTube chat, we will pick up on Slack and request the four of them to take a stab at it and continue the conversation. Please also subscribe to our YouTube channel and join us on all our other social media platforms, because we do plan some very interesting conversations around the year, and there is more interesting stuff that's coming up. We're really grateful for the kind of feedback and response to this masterclass. So thank you for joining. I wish there was more time to continue this chat. We could have easily gone on for another hour if we so wished, but I'm acutely conscious of the time. So on that note, I would love, kind of say thank you to our panel and to our audience for joining us this evening. Thank you, and wish you a great day ahead and week ahead. So thank you again. Bye.
Thank you, Indrajit.